So there have been a number of forerunners and proponents of alternative science and energy over the past couple hundred years. Among them, Nikola Tesla, Viktor Schauberger, Townsend Brown, Otis Carr, Searl, and many others. But when we hear of the fabled anecdotal accounts from ancient times concerning how the pyramids and other ancient megaliths were built, they seem to be the most similar to accounts of John World Keely's work. Harnessing sound vibrations in unique and exotic ways, Keely is said to have been able to apply a quote-unquote force to heavy engines, large steel cylinders, and massive steel reservoirs to render them light enough to lift up one finger or hand, or even to levitate them completely. There are also accounts of him being able to selectively levitate small iron weights at the bottom of water-filled jars, to send heavy balls flying by playing on a mouth organ, as well as disintegrating quartz. In addition to the accounts of John World Keely, there are also a couple other modern accounts. One is an account of a Swedish doctor by the name of Searl, who traveled to Tibet and allegedly witnessed a large group of monks using a cacophony of large musical instruments to levitate large boulders up the side of a steep cliff in order to build a temple. Still another account in Tibet was by an Austrian traveler named Lenar, who described sounds from a huge gong and a large string instruments used in conjunction with two large reflective screens to temporarily render a heavy block light enough such that the monk could easily push it around or even lift it with one hand. The same monk claimed that the same technique had been used by his ancestors to build fortified walls around the whole of Tibet, and that similar instruments could be used to disintegrate stone. When we directly compare these more modern accounts to the ancient accounts, there are a number of very interesting similarities. These fascinating stories make accounts of Keely's work and his ideas all the more intriguing, especially since these accounts make the attempt to highlight actual scientific principles which are supposed to be involved in such techniques. Keely's particular method of levitation and propulsion was called aerial navigation, and it was allegedly made possible by two related processes called vibratory lift and vibratory push process. Vibratory lift was defined as levitation caused by vibration and involved the redefining of gravity as a resultant force between a force of levity and a force of attraction. Vibratory push process seems to be less easy to define, but if vibratory lift was to be the method of suspension, then vibratory push was likely the method of propulsion of the suspended object or conveyance. It will follow that if vibration could propel an object against gravity or cancel it out altogether, then it might be able to push or pull object with it as well. This describes a system very much like maglev in that the same basic force of magnetism is used in different ways to provide both suspension and propulsion. But actually, vibration or vibratory lift and vibratory push process, as they are described, are potentially much more versatile in their approximation of the repulsor lift technology of Star Wars, and that it would enable the stable suspension of immensely massive objects from a height of just above the Earth's surface to practically any height in the Earth's atmosphere. The little information that I could find seemingly relating to the vibratory push process is included in the article here, which seems to define vibratory push as a type of pressure force which accelerates and extends the range of molecular oscillation. The article goes on to say that it causes molecular dissociation and a decrease in weight. And very interesting is that it is said to be of a similar nature to the centrifugal aspect of rotation. The opposite of this pressor force is called the tractor force, which both reduces molecular oscillation and causes a concentration of mass and densification. This force aspect is particularly interesting in light of our recent research into the work of Viktor Schauberger, and that the tractor force is said to concentrate, pull, and attract, and is associated with the centripetal aspect of rotation. There is a constant push-pull, a dynamic between the pressor and tractor forces, which results in the aforementioned leftover aspect, which Keely called the dominant, or the more familiar term of gravity. Thus, in order to alter gravity and make objects heavier, lighter, or to levitate them completely, would be to modify this balance so as to give predominance to either the pressor for levity or the tractor for supergravitation. The theory of vibratory lift is fascinating, but quite involved in detail, so I will devote a separate discussion of it in an upcoming video. In the ancient accounts, levitation or weight negation is usually highlighted, but after the heavy objects are suspended in the air or rendered easier to move, they are often said to be moved by the external physical force from people, or in some stories even described as moving as though having a life of their own, perhaps similar to what we would call surface acoustic wave or SAW. However, vibratory push, as described above, may point to another possibility, as it is described as being a force aspect of dissociation and propulsion in the form of pushing. One ancient account in particular seems to describe that very process. In explaining how the ancient Egyptians transported some of the large building blocks of stone from quarries and ships, a historian named Ali al-Masudi claimed that a magical papyrus was placed under the stone to be moved. And when this stone was struck with a metal rod, the stone is said to have levitated and moved forward the length of a bow shot, which was about 200 feet. Other versions of the story say that the stones also moved over a path of paved stones, fenced on either side by metal poles placed into the ground, arousing some ideas of electromagnetism being brought into play. Still, there is another, even more descriptive version, which was pulled from the files of the late alternative science guru Jerry Decker. This version says that a stone was covered on 4 of its 6 sides with wet papyrus. A specially carved wooden rather than metal rod was struck against the uncovered stone face, the other uncovered side, of course, being in contact with the ground. While holding the rod, the vibrations would continue to increase, and at its greatest amplitude, the rod was reapplied to the exposed stone face. The vibrational energy from the rod suffused through the stone, causing temporary and simultaneous levitation and propulsion for the aforementioned 200 feet. Additionally, over the course of some research, I've even come across a version of the story referring to metal sheets rather than papyrus, which would be placed under the stones, and that these sheets themselves, being metallic, would vibrate and carry the stones along with them, kind of similar to the proverbial flying carpet. Of course, it is important to note that the pyramids were already thousands of years old by the time Masudi had traveled to Egypt, and so his account was most likely a reiteration of oral traditions passed down from generation to generation of Egyptians. We might even have to accept the possibility that the story is entirely fabricated, though for what purpose would be just as entirely unclear. But nonetheless, it is yet another story of curiously similar details to accounts occurring in Keely's old workshop. Levitation in the Masudi account is definitely involved as in other anecdotal accounts, but an added dimension of propulsion is added. However, the stones did not levitate and propel indefinitely, but rather in short, repeated bursts, each burst lasting only as long as the resonant vibrations within the stone were sustained. The theory is that the vibrations began to dwindle as the vibrations began to dwindle in strength. The mode of movement was lost by the same proportion, with the stone eventually resettling back down to the ground 200 feet away, after which the process would be repeated until the stones were at the building site. This indeed sounds very much like the descriptions of the Keely vibratory push or pressure force. So in summary, it sounds as though the stones were rendered either frictionless or weightless, perhaps levitating just above the ground, and also propelled by the vibrations while in that frictionless or weightless state. But how would this work from a scientific point of view? In the experiment here, we see a powerful resonator in the state of acoustic lubrication as well as surface acoustic wave, which propels it slightly forward. As the resonator slides forward on the PVC rails and contacts the edge of the tape, it is quickly propelled backwards as the mechanical waves are reflected back at it. In another experiment, we see the vibrating piston of the resonator repeatedly contacting and propelling the wooden pendulum. And looking closely at the contact point, we see that the wood is being hit pretty hard. Now, of course, these are small forces. However, we might be able to reason out a more developed version of this experiment. If the acoustic vibrations could be made powerful enough to levitate the resonator, or at least render it able to move with near zero friction, then it tapping a reflective material would push it away very powerfully. Now, a particular detail regarding the striking rod in the Jerry Decker version of the Masudi account is especially interesting. It says that while holding the rod, the vibrations would continue to increase, and at its greatest amplitude, the rod would be reapplied to the stone. So the rod would vibrate when struck, similar to a large tuning fork. It also says that the vibrations will continue to increase. Now, a detail might be missing here, as I believe that the rod, like a tuning fork, will have to be struck multiple times in order for the amplitude of the vibrations to actually increase. Otherwise, the vibrations will only persist for a short time until they gradually faded away. In other words, additional percussive energy will have to be added in order to increase the amplitude. That is, unless the rod itself was a piece of technology with its own internal power source. And indeed, there is a version of the story that includes a powered rod, claiming that the rod would receive a sample of the stone's own resonant frequency and then vibrate at that same frequency at an increasing amplitude before it would be reapplied to the stone. But if the rod were a more passive device, then additional external energy will have to be added in order for it to build up as described. The rod will be reapplied to the face of the stone, and there will be enough energy for the stone to glide forward. But going back to the vibratory push concept, the quick individual taps does result in rhythmic pushes. However, this is really not the primary effect that we're looking for. Looking more closely here, we see the sliding resonator being sharply repelled when it runs into the wooden wedge. This happens when the vibrations are reflected back at it by the wedge. This sonic reflection is the effect that we want to isolate and magnify. A strong vibratory push with just a slight touch. With that, we could imagine the tapping of the stone with the rod resonator would result in the rod vibrating at its resonant frequency similar to a tuning fork, and which would likely be tuned to resonate at the same frequency as the stone or one of the stone's subharmonics. The rod would most likely be tapped several times to add additional energy and get it to vibrate at its maximum amplitude, after which it would be reapplied to the stone, which is also vibrating, and as a result is either in a frictionless state due to acoustic lubrication or in a weightless state due to acoustically induced anti-gravity. Now, if the stone were inert, then simply pushing the stone with a large force would only result in the priest or operator himself being propelled backwards instead of the stone being propelled forward due to the stone's much greater mass and inertia. But if the stone is in a frictionless state due to either acoustic lubrication or levitation, then even a small force could move it. But of course, the larger the force, the greater the acceleration of the stone, as per Newton's second law of motion, force equals mass times acceleration. And of course, there might be other forces that could be limiting factors, such as air resistance. We might also wonder whether or not acoustic levitation or anti-gravity might be subjected to some type of drag forces, just as the electrodynamic drag forces that are present in maglev systems. But even still, these forces will only serve to make the levitation and propulsion technique marginally less efficient. So this would be the most basic form of vibratory push, just as acoustic lubrication is a very basic form of vibratory lift. But Keely's ideas evolved over time and became much more advanced. This leads us to another of his alleged demonstrations, which was a prototype airship that was said to be demonstrated for the War Department. This airship consisted of a platform with his aerial propeller, a keyboard which was connected to a number of Chladni resonator plates, and a stool facing the keyboard upon which to sit. An excerpt from the account says that Mr. Keeley explained that these resonant plates will cause the craft to rise and float above the ground when subjected to a polarized field, which would generate a negative attraction. When the effect was produced, the craft would come under the influence of what Keely referred to as the etheric polar current and would levitate and hover just above the ground. He could accelerate the conveyance to any desired speed by dampening out certain notes on the keyboard. So it seems that by manipulating the degree to which these resonator plates interacted with this polar stream, Keely can make the craft ascend, descend, accelerate, and decelerate. Now, this interaction with a polarized field, which determine motion, is especially interesting given modern mainstream science's discovery of the Higgs boson field, a field that is said to pervade all of space and is filled with an even distribution of Higgs boson force particles. Mass, one of the primary characteristics of matter, is determined by how strongly the particles in matter interact with the force particles within this Higgs field. The stronger the interaction, the greater the mass. Light particles, on the other hand, do not interact with the field and thus have no mass. Hence, the speed of light can remain a universal constant, unlike with the previous etheric field model, which was developed to explain mass and the various energetic phenomena. So the Higgs boson field is essentially the new ether. And so, is it possible that sound is the mean by which these particle interactions can be modified, potentially allowing us a medium of practical gravity control, this as described in Keely's claimed airship demonstration? The more recent discovery of phonons, negative mass, and negative gravity might seem to support this line of thought. Is Keely's polar stream a component of what we now know of as the Higgs boson field? Is this polar stream composed of the Higgs force particles? And so it seems that Keely's ultimate propulsion concept was to bring the object or craft under the influence of this polar energetic stream, which, according to the description, possesses its own propulsive aspect, perhaps very similar to how a boat can be buoyed up and propelled by a water stream. So in this case, is vibratory push the pushing against or being pushed by the polar energetic stream rather than having to push off a physical object, as demonstrated in the earlier experiments? This pervasive polar energy concept might remind us of a quote from Nikola Tesla, who said that at some point in the future, quote, our machinery will be driven by a power obtainable at any point in the universe. Throughout space, there is energy. Is this energy static or kinetic? If static, our hopes are in vain. If kinetic, and this we know it is for certain, then it's a mere question of time when men will succeed in attaching their machinery to the very willwork of nature, end quote. Now, most people remember Nikola Tesla for his wireless transmission of energy concepts. But as we can see in the quote, his ultimate idea was not to have the need to transmit energy at all. Like John Keely, he visualized a system which would instead enable us to drive our machinery off of the inexhaustible power within the very space around us. Needless to say, the research continues. But again, the Masudi account and several others like it sound very similar to the fabled accounts of the acoustic powers in Keely's workshop. Was John Keely aware of these stories? Did they inspire his own work? And if so, how did he know? According to the book, Free Energy Pioneer by author Theo Pagemans, the idea of Keely as a loner and rogue inventor is not entirely accurate, and that he was in contact with a vast occult science underground present in Philadelphia at the time. These secret societies were reflective and undoubtedly connected to those occurring in parts of Europe during the same time. Societies which spurned modern industrialism and instead supported a return to nature and a rediscovery of the more subtle, almost paranormal forces and energies of the universe. These energies and forces were seen as the true source of the powers of the alchemists and shamans of old. Capacities lost in the age of reason and the overdevelopment and over-reliance on left brain logic at the expense of right brain intuition and faculties. Did the occult science underground have even more detailed information about ancient technologies contained within traditions and secret manuscripts passed down from ancient times? Details which are missing from the brief fables and legends which we are left with? In relative contrast, there are claims of very detailed ancient instructions on how to build vimanas, aircraft that were allegedly built and flown in ancient India, and which were said to have flown by means of anti-gravity and exotic means of propulsion. Of course, many investigators have concluded that such craft are purely the work of fiction and would not have flown according to aerodynamic principles. But then again, similar claims are often made about modern UFOs, namely that their shapes are not aerodynamic and that the speeds at which they fly, turn, and make altitude changes would destroy any living occupants within. Perhaps it's possible that UFOs are merely remote-controlled experimental aircraft. Others claim that such advanced craft possess a type of inertial dampening. Nevertheless, their ability to fly at such speeds, despite their non-aerodynamic designs, is curious and points to unconventional means of propulsion. At the very least, it may be possible that ancient peoples did conceive of flying vehicles, but simply lacked the materials to actually create one. We know that this is indeed possible from the detailed sketches and writings of Leonardo da Vinci, which included a submarine, a parachute, and an ornithopter. the latter being a proposed flying machine that would fly by flapping its wings. These are devices which apparently never came into fruition during Leonardo da Vinci's lifetime, but he is regarded in some circles as the first in the modern world to have attempted to study and quantify aerodynamic forces, and thus he is considered a major inspiration of modern aviation. Many have even attempted to build his devices just as described, and with some success. But it took considerable time for modern technology to catch up with his ideas. Was Keely similarly inspired by the ideas of ancient sacred science? Present-day investigators have recently discovered that sound vibrations as phonons actually carry negative mass and can hence generate negative gravity as they travel through a medium, whether that medium be air, water, or a huge stone. So it's modern science finally beginning to catch up with Keely, and by implication, in ancient engineering science? Edward Lee Skownin, the builder of Coral Castle, an astonishing modern megalith located in Homestead, Florida, once claimed that he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids. In his own words, he said, quote, "I have found out how the Egyptians and ancient builders in Peru, Yucatan, and Asia, with only primitive tools, raised and set into place blocks of stone weighing many tons." End quote. Are there others who also knew of these secrets of the great megaliths of the past? Was John Worrell Keely one of them? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. And as always, stay tuned.